What happened when you insulted a samurai story? 1. The merchant's fatal mistake. Insult and the code of honor pulls. Subscribe our channel to listen more historic stories. Section 1. The system of hierarchy and honor. You are standing in the streets of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, in the year 1635. The bustling city is alive with activity. Merchants hawking their wares call out prices in the marketplace. Women in elaborate kimonos move through the streets with measured grace. Children play between wooden buildings that line narrow alleyways. But if you look closely, you will notice something that defines the entire social order of this moment. Everyone moves with deliberate awareness of their place. Walking down this street are 4 distinct groups of people, and their position in society is visible in their clothing, their bearing, the way others treat them. At the top are the samurai, recognizable by their 2 swords, the symbol of their warrior class. They wear fine silk garments, and people move out of their way without being asked. Below them are the farmers who feed the nation, and they occupy a strange middle position, respected for their essential work, but ranked below those with military power. Below them are the artisans and craftspeople, skilled workers whose talents built the cities and made goods. And at the bottom, a position that might surprise you if you do not understand the Japanese feudal system, are the merchants. Yes, the merchants. Despite being among the wealthiest people in Edo, despite controlling enormous amounts of money and goods, the merchant class was considered the lowest of the 4 main classes. This was not accidental. It was deliberate policy rooted in Confucian philosophy that had shaped Japanese society. Merchants were seen as people who profited from others' labor without creating anything of value themselves. They were parasites on society, enriching themselves while contributing nothing to the nation's spiritual or martial strength. This created a peculiar tension in Edo society. Wealthy merchants lived in luxurious homes and could afford fine clothes and food, but they could not hold political power. They could not become samurai. They could not sit in the presence of a samurai without permission. And they certainly could not insult one. The merchant we are concerned with, and history has largely forgotten his name, though some sources call him Tanaka, was a cloth merchant of considerable wealth. He dealt in silk fabrics, the finest materials imported from across Asia. His shop in central Edo was successful, well-known, and frequented by wealthy clients. By the standards of the merchant class, he was extraordinarily successful. He had money, influence within his social circle, and respect from his peers. But he did not have power. He could never have power. On a particular day in the autumn of 1635, Tanaka was transporting a shipment of expensive silk through the Edo streets. The bolt of fabric was rare, a deep crimson dyed with materials that had taken months to import. The bolt was so long that it required multiple people to carry it, and Tanaka walked alongside his employees, ensuring the precious cargo made it safely to his warehouse. As he walked, he encountered a samurai. This samurai was a Ronin, a masterless samurai, a warrior without a lord. Ronin occupied a strange position in Japanese society. They had the status and training of samurai but without the steady income and security of serving a daimyo, a feudal lord. Many Ronin were unemployed through no fault of their own. Their lords had been defeated in war or had died without heirs, leaving their samurai without positions. Others had chosen to leave their service. Regardless of how they came to their status, Ronin were often desperate, skilled fighters with no income, no stable future, and the resentment that comes from having fallen from stable employment into uncertainty. This particular Ronin was poor. You could see it in his clothing, which was worn but maintained with the careful attention that indicated poverty, trying to preserve dignity. His swords showed signs of wear, still sharp, still well maintained, but not the gleaming weapons of a samurai with a wealthy lord. He had probably not eaten well that day. He looked hungry. When Tanaka and his workers passed the Ronin on the street, carrying the bolt of crimson silk, something happened. The sources disagree on exactly what was said, but the result is consistent. Tanaka insulted the Ronin. The exact nature of the insult matters, and historians have debated it for centuries. Some sources suggest that Tanaka made a derogatory comment about the Ronin's poverty, suggesting that a warrior without a lord was less than a complete human being. Others indicate that Tanaka made a crude joke, perhaps implying that the Ronin should find employment more suitable to his reduced status. Still others suggest that Tanaka simply did not bow with sufficient respect when passing, treating the Ronin as a social equal rather than acknowledging the samurai's inherent superiority. But here is the crucial thing to understand. The exact words do not matter as much as what the insult represented. In Japanese culture of this era, particularly in the Edo period, insult to a samurai was not merely a matter of hurt feelings. It was a direct challenge to the entire system of hierarchy that defined society. If a merchant, someone at the lowest rank of free people, could insult a samurai without consequence, then what did samurai status mean? If warriors could be disrespected by cloth merchants, then on what was the entire social order based? The Ronin's response was immediate. He drew one of his swords, not both, but the longer katana, and moved toward Tanaka with clear intent. Here is where you might expect the story to proceed as stories often do. The merchant runs. A crowd gathers. The samurai is stopped by authorities. Order is restored, a lesson is learned. But this is not how the story proceeded, because you are studying real history, and real history is often far stranger and more disturbing than fiction. What happened next depends on which account you believe. Most sources indicate that Tanaka's workers attempted to shield him. There may have been a struggle. There may have been an attempt to disarm the Ronin or to convince him that the insult was not intended as serious. But whatever happened in those chaotic moments, the result was clear. The Ronin killed Tanaka. Not killed in self-defense, not in a formal duel, but struck him down in the street. A merchant cut down by a warrior for the crime of insufficient respect. And then something equally strange happened. The Ronin did not attempt to escape. He stood there in the street, his sword still in his hand, surrounded by shocked onlookers, and waited for the authorities to arrive. He did not flee. He did not try to hide. He simply waited, his weapon at his side, accepting what he knew would come next. When the Edo authorities arrived, the local police force, separate from the samurai class, they arrested the Ronin. They did not treat him with deference. A man who killed another in the street, regardless of his status, had committed a crime against the shogun's peace. The Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Edo had laws, and those laws applied even to samurai. But here is the question that hung over this case. The reason it became famous and was documented and debated for centuries afterward. What would happen to the Ronin? And what did his fate reveal about the true nature of power, honor, and justice in Edo, Japan? The answers to those questions involve understanding something far deeper than a simple murder. They involve understanding the code of honor that governed samurai behavior, the tension between feudal loyalty and the emerging centralized state, and the way that insult and violence were not separate phenomena, but rather intimately connected to questions of survival and dignity in a rigidly hierarchical society. Section D. The trial and the code of Bushido. The lie. Ronin's case became the talk of Edo. In a city of nearly 1 million people, one of the largest cities in the world at that time, news traveled quickly through markets, tea houses, and street corners. A merchant had been killed by a samurai for a minor insult. The samurai had not resisted arrest. He was now imprisoned in a holding facility, awaiting judgment from the authorities. But the case was complicated in ways that immediately became apparent to anyone who understood the intricacies of Edo justice. The authorities faced a dilemma that had no clean solution. Because Japanese law in this era was not a single unified code but rather a layering of different legal systems, different claims to authority, and different understandings of justice that often contradicted each other. On one level, this was a simple case of murder. A man had been killed in the street by another man wielding a sword. Under the basic laws of the shogunate, the military government that had ruled Japan for over a century, this was a crime. The authorities had authority to arrest, try, and execute the perpetrator. By this standard, the Ronin should have faced execution. The Tokugawa shogunate had worked hard to establish order in Japan after decades of civil war. One of their central policies was the elimination of arbitrary violence. Samurai could not simply kill people whenever they felt disrespected. If that were allowed, the shogunate's control would collapse into chaos. But on another level, the case was far more complex. The Ronin was a samurai, and samurai operated under a different code. The unwritten but deeply understood code of honor known as Bushido. Bushido was not law in the formal sense. It was not written in any official document. Rather, it was a set of cultural expectations about how samurai should behave. And it was enforced through social pressure, through family honor, and through the threat of becoming Ronin oneself if one violated its principles too egregiously. Under Bushido, a samurai who was insulted had not merely a right but potentially an obligation to respond. To ignore an insult was to accept a diminishment of status. It was to admit that the other person's words held truth. If a merchant said that a samurai was beneath him or unworthy of respect, and the samurai did nothing, then perhaps the merchant was correct. Perhaps the samurai's status was indeed fragile. There was even a formal way to address such situations. If a samurai felt he had been seriously insulted, he could challenge the other party to a formal duel, a contest with weapons that would resolve the dispute and restore honor to whoever emerged victorious. These duels, called seppuku challenges when they involved ritual suicide, were recognized by society as an appropriate way to handle matters of honor. But the Ronin had not challenged Tanaka to a formal duel. He had killed him in the street, apparently in a moment of rage, without the ritual and ceremony that would have made the killing acceptable under Bushido. This created the dilemma. If the authorities executed the Ronin, they would be enforcing the shogunate's law against arbitrary violence. But they would also be punishing a samurai for responding to an insult, punishing him for defending his honor in a way that Bushido suggested was appropriate. This would alienate the samurai class, who would see it as the shogunate interfering in matters of honor that were traditionally the samurai's domain to regulate. On the other hand, if the authorities did not execute the Ronin, if they treated him leniently because he was samurai, then they would be suggesting that samurai were above the law. They would be undermining the entire legal structure that the shogunate had spent a century establishing. The trial itself, as recorded in historical documents, reveals this tension vividly. The Ronin was questioned about his actions. Yes, he admitted he had killed the merchant. Yes, the merchant had insulted him. Yes, he understood that he had done so without prior formal challenge. But he also maintained that his response, while perhaps excessive, was reasonable given the nature of the insult. He had been defending his honor as a samurai. The merchant had attempted to treat him as less than equal, and he had responded. Witnesses were called. The merchant's employees testified about what had happened. Some suggested the insult had been minor, barely worth notice. Others, and this is important, suggested that the merchant had been particularly cruel, that he had mocked not just the Ronin but the entire samurai class, suggesting that warriors without lords were parasites on society just as merchants were. If this testimony was accurate, then the insult took on a different character. It was not just a personal affront, but an attack on the samurai's identity itself. The authorities were clearly troubled. Records indicate that the trial lasted longer than typical murder cases, with judges deliberating extensively. Buddhist monks were consulted for spiritual guidance. Officials of the shogunate discussed the case at length. The question was not whether the Ronin had killed the merchant. He admitted this openly, but rather what his punishment should be. Here is where you encounter one of the strangest aspects of this case. The Ronin's own attitude. Rather than defending himself vigorously or pleading for mercy, the Ronin appears to have accepted that he would be punished. In fact, according to some accounts, he seemed to expect execution. But he also seemed to believe that his actions had been justified, that he had done what Bushido required. He expressed no regret for killing the merchant. He expressed only regret that he had not done so in a more formal, ritualistic manner. This attitude, the calm acceptance of punishment combined with the belief that the underlying action was correct, was itself a form of power. It was a statement that the Ronin valued his honor more than his life. It suggested that no punishment the shogunate could inflict, would change his view that he had been right to respond to the insult. This was dangerous from the shogunate's perspective, because it implied that samurai ethics and shogunate law were fundamentally in conflict. The authorities eventually reached a decision, and it was characteristically Japanese in its attempt to navigate between competing demands. The Ronin would be executed, but he would be executed in a way that honored his status as a samurai. Specifically, he would be allowed to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than being executed by common executioners. Seppuku was a form of capital punishment reserved for samurai of some status. It involved the condemned person disemboweling himself with a short blade, a process that was typically quite painful and slow. But it was considered an honorable death, one that allowed a samurai to maintain his dignity even in execution. It was a concession to Bushido even while the shogunate was enforcing its law against arbitrary violence. The date of the Ronin's seppuku was set for a cold morning in the winter of 1635. Witnesses gathered, both officials of the shogunate and members of the samurai class. The Ronin was dressed in white clothing, traditional for seppuku. He sat in the formal seiza position, his legs folded beneath him. He wrote a death poem, as was customary, a brief composition reflecting on his life and death. Then, in a moment that lasted only seconds but that had taken weeks of legal maneuvering to arrange, he performed the ritual that would end his life. But the question that historians have pondered for nearly 400 years is this: was justice served? And what did this case reveal about the true hierarchy of power in Edo Japan? The obvious answer is that the shogunate won. They established that no one, not even a samurai, could commit murder in the streets with impunity. They enforced their law. They maintained order. But there is a deeper reading of the events. The Ronin achieved something remarkable. He elevated a merchant, the lowest class in society, to the level of a matter of honor. By killing Tanaka over an insult, the Ronin suggested that the merchant's words mattered, that they were significant enough to warrant a violent response. In doing so, he inadvertently granted the merchant a form of dignity. The merchant's insult had not been trivial. It had been grave enough to cost the Ronin his life. Moreover, the Ronin's willing acceptance of seppuku, his calm dignity in the face of death, his refusal to apologize or express remorse, all of this resonated with samurai culture in ways that probably strengthened Bushido rather than weakening it. Stories of his death would be told in samurai circles, would be remembered as an example of true honor. A warrior had stood by his principles even unto death. What greater endorsement of samurai values could there be? And the merchant? Tanaka was dead. His life ended because he had insulted someone. What did that say about the actual power structure in Edo, despite the official hierarchy? Section 3. The Legacy of Tanaka and the True Nature of Power. The Ronin's death by seppuku in the winter of 1635 should have ended the matter. A crime had been committed, justice had been administered, and the social order had been maintained. Life in Edo should have continued as before. But something unexpected happened. The case did not fade from memory. Instead, it became legendary. Within months, stories about the Ronin began circulating through samurai circles. Writers began documenting the event, crafting narratives that emphasized the Ronin's courage, his adherence to Bushido, his noble acceptance of death. The story spread from Edo to other cities, from samurai households to tea houses where merchants and common people gathered. A minor event, a merchant killed in the street, had become a parable about honor, hierarchy, and the true sources of power in Japanese society. What made the story so powerful was that it revealed something that official policy tried to obscure. Despite the shogunate's laws, despite the bureaucratic structures they had created, despite their military might, true power in Edo society still flowed through the code of honor that samurai upheld. The Ronin had broken the law, yes, but he had done so in defense of something that society recognized as valuable, his dignity. And in doing so, he had demonstrated that there were things more important than the shogunate's edicts. Things like personal honor that could move a man to kill and to die. The merchant Tanaka's family, in the aftermath of his death, faced a peculiar situation. They were wealthy. His death did not impoverish them, but they were also humiliated. Their relative had been killed by a samurai for an insult. This raised a disturbing question in their minds and in the minds of their peers. What exactly had Tanaka done that was so grave? What had he said that warranted his death? Some accounts suggest that Tanaka's family attempted to pursue compensation through the legal system. They petitioned the shogunate authorities, arguing that Tanaka had been murdered unjustly, that the merchant class deserved protection from samurai violence, that the Ronin's execution had not adequately addressed their loss. But these petitions were largely ignored. The authorities had already rendered judgment. The Ronin had been executed. The matter was officially closed. But unofficially something had shifted. Tanaka's death became a warning. It demonstrated to every merchant in Edo and throughout Japan that no amount of wealth could protect them from a samurai's blade. That despite their economic power, despite their importance to society's functioning, they remained fundamentally vulnerable. They could not fight back effectively. They were not trained in weapons, and it would have been illegal for them to carry swords as samurai did. They could only accept their subordinate status and hope that samurai would exercise restraint. This realization had profound consequences for merchant behavior. In the decades following Tanaka's death, merchants became notably more deferential towards samurai. They were more careful in their speech, more attentive to the signs that a samurai might be displeased, more willing to absorb insults or disrespect from the warrior class without responding. The merchant class, despite their growing wealth and importance to the economy, internalized their subordinate position. Tanaka's death had taught them the cost of forgetting their place. But there is another deeper reading of this event that historians have proposed. Some scholars suggest that Tanaka's death actually accelerated the eventual decline of samurai power in Japan. Here is the reasoning. The incident demonstrated that samurai authority ultimately rested on the willingness of society to accept it. The Ronin could kill the merchant only because society recognized his right to do so based on Bushido. But what if that social recognition began to erode? What if merchants began to view the killing of Tanaka not as a demonstration of samurai power, but as an example of samurai brutality? By the early 18th century, just decades after this incident, Stories about merchants being killed by samurai for minor infractions or no infractions at all had become more common. Some samurai, particularly Ronin desperate for money or status, began using violence against merchants in ways that seemed increasingly arbitrary. The merchant class, growing wealthier and more educated, began to question why they should accept this. Stories circulated of merchants defending themselves, of samurai being brought before courts, of the old assumptions about hierarchy being challenged. By the end of the Edo period in the mid-19th century, when Japan began its rapid modernization, samurai power had become a historical relic. Merchants, on the other hand, had become crucial to Japan's transformation into a modern industrial state. The rigid hierarchy that had placed merchants at the bottom had collapsed. One could argue that Tanaka's death, far from demonstrating the permanence of samurai power, had actually foreshadowed its inevitable decline. The incident had revealed the fragility of a system based ultimately on violence and social acceptance, rather than on any genuine source of power. Tanaka himself, of course, never saw any of this. He died believing that he lived in a world where samurai were superior, where merchants were subordinate, where the hierarchy was eternal and unchangeable. He could not have imagined a Japan where merchants would become industrialists and where samurai would fade into history. But his death became a data point in the long arc of Japanese history, a moment where the tensions beneath the surface of Edo society became visible. What is perhaps most haunting about this case is the question of the insult itself. What exactly did Tanaka say or do that warranted his death? History has not preserved the specific words. We know only that it was insulting enough to provoke a samurai to violence. But this ambiguity raises a troubling question. How much disrespect was truly necessary? How carefully did one have to calibrate one's behavior to avoid provoking a samurai to murderous rage? The answer, of course, is that you could never be careful enough. There was no formula, no set of rules that a merchant could follow that would guarantee safety. The Ronin's response was ultimately arbitrary, based on his mood, his hunger, his desperation, his understanding of honor. And this arbitrariness, this fundamental unpredictability, was perhaps the greatest source of samurai power. It kept others in a state of constant vigilance, constantly aware that a wrong word or gesture could result in death. In modern contexts, we might recognize this as a form of systemic violence. The threat did not need to be exercised frequently to be effective. The mere knowledge that insulting a samurai could result in death, combined with the uncertainty about what exactly constituted an insult, was enough to shape behavior. Merchants learned to be deferential, to watch their words, to move aside when samurai approached. The system perpetuated itself through fear and the occasional carefully remembered execution. The trial and execution of the Ronin, then, were not simply about justice. They were about maintaining a system of control. The shogunate's decision to allow seppuku, rather than execution by common means, was not a concession to samurai honor so much as it was an acknowledgement that the samurai class needed to maintain their own internal discipline. The system worked only as long as samurai believed in Bushido, only as long as they saw their code as legitimate. By allowing the Ronin an honorable death, The authorities preserved that belief while still technically enforcing their law. But this compromise also contained the seeds of the system's eventual destruction. By acknowledging Bushido as legitimate enough to grant an honorable death, the shogunate was also acknowledging that samurai ethics were sometimes in conflict with state law, and that when they conflicted, the state was willing to compromise. Over time, as the contradictions between these systems became more apparent, as merchants became wealthier and more influential, as new ideas from the West began to penetrate Japan, the compromise would break down. The hierarchy would collapse. The samurai would fade. Tanaka's death then was not simply the tragic result of his insulting a desperate Ronin. It was a moment where the fundamental tensions of Edo society became visible. It was a demonstration that power, despite official hierarchies and legal codes, ultimately rested on force and on the acceptance of that force by those who lived under it. And it was a foreshadowing of the moment, less than 3 centuries later, when that acceptance would end, when samurai would be stripped of their power, and when merchants and their descendants would inherit the earth. The question that hangs over this case, the question that historians have debated for nearly 400 years, is this: who truly had power in this moment? The shogunate with their laws and their bureaucracy? The samurai with their swords and their code of honor? Or the merchant class who, despite their official subordination, were gradually accumulating the wealth and influence that would eventually transform society? Perhaps the answer is that all three had power, but of different kinds, and that history would ultimately determine which form would prove most durable. Story 2. The Ronin's Revenge. When a masterless warrior challenged an empire Section 1, The Fall from Grace, you are in the city of Kyoto, in the year 1660. The city is ancient, sacred, the cultural heart of Japan. Temples with sweeping roofs and intricate wooden carvings stand alongside merchant houses and samurai estates. The streets are lined with craftspeople, silk makers, swordsmiths, artists, whose work is renowned throughout Japan and beyond. The air carries the scent of incense from temples, the smell of wood smoke from cooking fires, the earthy aroma of tea houses where philosophers and poets gather to discuss art and meaning. But beneath this veneer of cultural sophistication, Kyoto is also a place of rigid hierarchy, of power struggles between different daimyo, feudal lords, and their samurai retainers. It is a place where a man's entire life, his livelihood, his identity, and his future can change in a single moment based on the whim of a superior or the unpredictable turn of political fortune. This is the world into which Asano Naganori was born. Asano was a samurai of considerable status, a man in his 30s who served as a high-ranking official in the court of the Shogun in Edo. He was well-educated, cultured, skilled in the arts of war and administration. He came from a respected samurai family with a long history of service to powerful lords. By all measures, Asano had achieved what most samurai aspire to: a stable position in a powerful household, respect from his peers, security for his family. But in 1701, Asano's life changed completely in a moment of rage that would echo through Japanese history for centuries. The incident occurred during a formal court ceremony in Edo. The shogun himself was present, along with hundreds of court officials, samurai, and aristocrats. These ceremonies were strictly choreographed events, with every movement prescribed by protocol, every gesture laden with meaning. The slightest error could be interpreted as disrespect or incompetence. Asano had been assigned to escort an important visiting dignitary through the ceremony. The dignitary was a court official named Kira Yoshinaka, a man in his 60s who held a high position in the shogun's administration. Kira was responsible for teaching proper court etiquette to samurai and nobles, and he had a reputation as someone who was meticulous to the point of obsession about proper behavior. According to the accounts that survive, Kira deliberately insulted Asano during the ceremony. The exact nature of the insult is disputed by historians. Some sources suggest that Kira gave Asano incorrect instructions about the ceremony, setting him up to make a mistake that would embarrass him. Others indicate that Kira made derogatory comments about Asano's family or background. Still others suggest that the insult was more subtle, a glance, a tone of voice, something that could be interpreted as disrespectful, but was difficult to prove. Whatever the exact nature of the insult, the effect on Asano was immediate and profound. Asano, a man trained in the martial arts, accustomed to command, suddenly found himself humiliated in front of the most powerful people in Japan. The shogun himself was watching. Hundreds of court officials witnessed his shame. What happened next violated every protocol of Edo court behavior. Asano, in a moment of rage, drew his sword, a short blade that samurai were permitted to carry even in the palace, and attacked Kira. The blow was not fatal. Kira was wounded but not killed. But the act itself was catastrophic. Drawing a weapon in the palace, attacking a court official in the presence of the shogun, was an act of treason. It violated the most fundamental laws of the realm. Asano was immediately arrested. Guards surrounded him and disarmed him. He was taken into custody, his fate now in the hands of the shogun's justice system. The ceremony ended in chaos. The careful order of the court had been shattered by one man's moment of uncontrolled rage. Within days, Asano was tried for his crime. The trial was brief. There was no question of his guilt. Hundreds of witnesses had seen him draw his sword and attack Kira. The only question was punishment, and here the law was clear. The penalty for attacking a court official in the palace in the presence of the shogun was death. Specifically, it was seppuku, ritual suicide, which was considered an honorable death for a samurai as opposed to execution by common means. But there was more to Asano's punishment than his own death. Because Asano was not simply an individual, he was the head of a samurai household, a clan. Under Japanese feudal law, when a daimyo, a lord, was executed for treason or a serious crime, his entire domain was confiscated by the shogun. His family lost their lands, their wealth, their status. The household was disbanded. The samurai who served under him became Ronin, masterless warriors without employment, without income, without the security that had defined their entire lives. This collective punishment was not accidental or arbitrary. It was deliberate policy. The shogunate wanted to ensure that daimyo and high-ranking samurai understood the consequences of defying the law. One man's moment of rage would cost hundreds of people their livelihoods. It would create a ripple effect of suffering that extended far beyond the individual perpetrator. Asano was given several weeks to prepare for his death. He was allowed to put his affairs in order, to write letters to his family, to compose a death poem. He spent his final days in contemplation and preparation for the honorable death that awaited him. On the appointed day, he performed seppuku with the dignity and composure expected of a samurai. He died with his honor intact, having accepted his punishment as just. But his death created a problem that would persist and grow more serious with each passing day. Asano had approximately 47 samurai retainers who served in his household. These were men who had devoted their lives to serving him, who had trained together, fought together, lived together as a military unit. They had status and income as long as Asano's domain existed. Now suddenly they had nothing. They were Ronin, masterless warriors in a society that had no real place for them. They could not hold regular employment. Their training was in warfare and service to a lord, not in trade or craft. They had no income and no prospects. Moreover, they were deeply humiliated. Their lord had been executed for attacking a court official. In their view, their lord had been provoked, had been insulted, and had responded as a samurai should respond to an insult, with force. Yes, the response had violated court protocol, but in their understanding of Bushido, in their code of honor, Asano had been correct to respond. The fault lay not with Asano but with Kira, who had insulted him. In the months following Asano's death, these 47 Ronin found themselves in an impossible situation. They could not restore their lord. He was dead, and their service to him was at an end. They could not regain their positions or their income. They faced a future of poverty and obscurity, but they also faced something that to a samurai might be worse than poverty: the knowledge that their lord had died unavenged. Kira, the man who had provoked Asano, remained alive, remained in his position, remained honored and secure while Asano lay dead and his household was destroyed. In samurai culture, there was a concept called katakuchi, revenge on behalf of one's lord. If a samurai's lord was killed or seriously wronged by someone, the samurai had not just a right but potentially an obligation to seek revenge. To fail to seek revenge was to accept a permanent stain on one's honor and the honor of one's lord's memory. It was to admit that your lord's death did not matter, that no one cared enough to avenge him. But katakuchi was forbidden by shogunate law. The shogun had decreed that no one could take revenge outside the legal system. Personal vendettas were prohibited. If someone was wronged, they were supposed to petition the authorities for justice, not take matters into their own hands. Samurai who engaged in katakuchi would be executed as criminals, not honored as loyal retainers. So these 47 Ronin faced an impossible choice. Their code of honor demanded that they avenge their lord. The law of the land forbade it. To honor their lord would be to violate the shogun's law and face certain death. To obey the law would be to betray their lord and live forever with shame. What they decided to do in the months following Asano's death would make them legendary. They resolved to wait. They dispersed throughout Japan, some of them taking civilian jobs to avoid suspicion, some of them hiding in remote areas, some of them attempting to lead normal lives. To any observer, they appeared to have accepted their new status as Ronin and moved on. They gave no indication of any plans for revenge. They did not gather, did not communicate obviously with one another, did not do anything that would alert the shogunate authorities to their intentions. But they were waiting for the right moment. They were preparing, and they were in contact with one another through a network of secret communications. The question that hung over these meant a question that the authorities of the shogunate would eventually become aware of, was whether they would actually attempt to avenge their lord, and if so, what the consequences would be for all of them, for Kira, and for the very nature of loyalty and honor in Edo, Japan. Section 2. The Plot and the Waiting Game. The months following Asano's death were tense throughout the shogunate's administration. The authorities were acutely aware that the 47 Ronin represented a potential threat. A group of trained warriors all bound by loyalty to a dead master, all facing a future of degradation and poverty. This was exactly the kind of situation that could explode into violence. The shogunate took precautions. They increased surveillance of Kira, the man the Ronin might target. They spread rumors that suggested they knew of the Ronin's intentions, hoping to intimidate them into abandoning any plans for revenge. They made it clear through official channels that anyone attempting katakuchi would be hunted down and executed. But the Ronin were patient. This patience was itself a form of power, a demonstration of the discipline that set samurai apart from ordinary criminals. An ordinary criminal seeking revenge might strike quickly, driven by rage and desperation. But these men were samurai, trained in strategy, in the careful calculation of advantage, in the virtue of patience. They understood that impulsive action would only result in their swift capture and execution. To truly honor their lord, they needed to succeed in their revenge, or at the very least, to ensure that their attempt was so significant, so dramatic, that it would be remembered for centuries. The leader of this group was a samurai named Oishi Kuranosuke, a man in his 50s who had served as Asano's chief retainer. Oishi was educated, intelligent, and deeply respected by the other Ronin. He became the coordinator of their efforts, the man who planned their strategy and maintained their resolve through months of uncertainty and hardship. Oishi's strategy was brilliant in its deception. Rather than immediately attempting to locate and kill Kira, he deliberately spread false information about his own activities. He allowed himself to be seen drinking excessively in bars and tea houses. He was observed in the company of geishas, entertainers, in ways that suggested he had abandoned his samurai code entirely. He gambled. He became known as a dissolute Ronin, living a life of pleasure rather than honor. This carefully constructed image served multiple purposes. First, it convinced the shogunate authorities that Oishi had abandoned any plans for revenge, that he was simply a masterless warrior trying to survive in the only way available to him, through vice and dissipation. The surveillance on him became less intense as the authorities concluded he was not a serious threat. Second, it prevented Kira from becoming complacent, but in a different way. Kira, seeing reports of Oishi's dissolute behavior, might have felt secure, believing that the Ronin had lost their resolve and their focus. But Kira would also hear the rumors circulating through samurai circles, the whispered suggestion that Oishi's behavior was a disguise, that the Ronin were still planning revenge. This uncertainty, this perpetual anxiety was part of the psychological warfare. Meanwhile, the other Ronin were scattered throughout Japan, living quiet lives, maintaining their deception. Some worked as laborers or merchants, some lived in remote temples. Having become monks or taking monastic vows, they were invisible, ordinary, indistinguishable from the general population, but they were in contact with one another through carefully encrypted messages and trusted intermediaries. They were waiting for Oishi's signal. During this period, which stretched on for months, then for over a year, the Ronin faced their own internal struggles. Living in poverty was humiliating for men accustomed to the status and respect of samurai. Several of them died during this period, either from illness or suicide, unable to bear the shame of their reduced circumstances. Others, particularly the younger Ronin, questioned whether the wait was worth it. Why not act now? Why continue this degradation? But Oishi held firm. He understood something crucial about the nature of the task before them. Kira was not an unprotected civilian. He was a high-ranking official with access to guards and security. He lived in a fortified residence. Killing him would require meticulous planning, precise timing, and the element of surprise. Any hasty attempt would likely fail, would result in the Ronin being captured, and would bring shame on their lord's memory, rather than honor. So they waited. And as they waited, something unexpected happened. The shogunate authorities began to relax their vigilance. Time passed. Years went by. The immediate shock of Asano's execution faded. The Ronin remained scattered, seemingly harmless, no longer the urgent threat they had initially appeared to be. Official attention shifted to other matters. The surveillance diminished further, but there was another dimension to the waiting that is often overlooked by historians focused on the dramatic revenge itself. The waiting was itself a form of loyalty to Asano. Each day that the Ronin endured poverty and degradation without abandoning their purpose was a day they honored their lord. Each hardship they suffered, each moment of shame they experienced was a sacrifice made in his name. In a sense, the waiting was not simply a tactical necessity, but a spiritual practice, a way of demonstrating the depth of their commitment through sustained suffering. During this extended period of waiting, relationships between the Ronin began to deepen, and also to fracture. Some of them, particularly those who were younger or who had families, began to question the whole enterprise. Was it truly honorable to sacrifice everything? Their lives, their future, their families' security for the sake of revenge? Some argued that Asano would not have wanted them to suffer this way, that loyalty to his memory might be better served by moving on with their lives rather than preparing to die in a failed assassination attempt. These doubts created internal conflicts. At one point, one of the Ronin actually attempted to kill Kira on his own, trying to force the issue and resolve the tension, but the attempt failed, and the Ronin was captured and executed. This failure and this death actually served to strengthen the resolve of the remaining Ronin. They saw it as a sign that the time was not yet right, that they needed to continue their careful planning and their patience. 2 years after Asano's death, something changed. Kira began to let his guard down. Perhaps he believed that enough time had passed, that the Ronin would never act. Perhaps he felt secure in his position. Whatever the reason, Kira's security became less stringent. He began to move about more freely, and Oishi, watching and waiting from his position of apparent dissolution, recognized the moment he had been waiting for. But before the Ronin could act, there was another complication. An informant, someone who had learned of the Ronin's plans, reported the impending assassination to the shogunate authorities. The government, suddenly aware that after 2 years of waiting the Ronin were about to move, faced an impossible situation. They could not arrest the Ronin without evidence of an actual crime. They could not simply execute men who had committed no crime yet. But they also could not allow an assassination to occur. The shogunate made a decision. They would contact Oishi and demand that the Ronin abandon their plans for revenge. They would threaten the Ronin with execution if they proceeded. They would use the authority of the shogun to prevent the assassination. But Oishi and the Ronin were past the point of being intimidated by threats. They had prepared, waited, sacrificed for 2 years. They had endured poverty and shame. They had lost some of their comrades. They were not going to turn back now. The moment had come. The question was whether they would succeed in killing Kira, and more importantly, what their actions would mean for the future of loyalty, honor, and the relationship between the individual and the state in Edo, Japan. Section 3. The Night of Vengeance and Its Consequences. The night of December 14, 1702, was cold and clear in Edo. Snow lay on the ground, and the city was quiet, most people indoors seeking warmth. Kira, the court official who had insulted Asano nearly 2 years earlier, was in his residence, an elegant home protected by walls and guards. He had no reason to expect danger. The shogunate had threatened the Ronin. Time had passed. Surely the moment of threat had passed as well. But the 47 Ronin were moving. They had coordinated their approach meticulously. They had divided into groups, each with a specific role. Some would scale the walls of Kira's residence. Others would guard the exits to prevent him from escaping. Still others would serve as lookouts, watching for the approach of the city guard. It was a military operation, carefully planned and precisely executed. These were not desperate criminals or passionate young men driven by emotional rage. These were disciplined warriors carrying out a mission. The initial assault on Kira's residence met with resistance. His guards, though taken by surprise, fought back. There was violence in the darkness, the clash of swords, the shouts of men fighting, the chaos of combat. But the Ronin had the advantage of preparation and overwhelming numbers. Kira's guards, though brave, were overwhelmed. Kira himself attempted to hide. As the Ronin searched through his residence, cutting down anyone who attempted to stop them, Kira fled through the rooms, looking for a way to escape or a place to conceal himself. According to some accounts, he hid in a shed in the garden, hoping the Ronin would search the main building and miss him. But the Ronin were thorough. They found him in his hiding place. What happened next depends on which account you read, but the basic fact is consistent. Kira was killed. Some sources indicate that Oishi himself performed the killing, striking the final blow that ended Kira's life. Others suggest that multiple Ronin attacked him simultaneously. Regardless of the details, the man who had insulted Asano 2 years earlier, the man whose insult had sparked a chain of events that had destroyed a household and transformed the lives of 47 samurai, was dead. But the Ronin did not attempt to flee. Instead, they carried Kira's severed head to the temple where Asano was buried. They placed the head on Asano's tomb as an offering, a physical demonstration that they had fulfilled their duty as retainers, that they had avenged their lord. And then, exhausted and knowing that their own deaths were now inevitable, they waited for the authorities to arrive. The shogunate response was swift and overwhelming. Word of the assassination spread rapidly through Edo. The city guard was mobilized. The authorities, knowing exactly where the Ronin were, they had not tried to hide, simply had to arrive at the temple and arrest them. The Ronin were taken into custody. There was no escape, no attempt to flee. They had known when they embarked on this mission that it would end in their own deaths. They had accepted this as the price of loyalty to their lord. What happened next was less a trial in the traditional sense and more a formal acknowledgement of what had occurred and what the punishment would be. The shogunate faced a delicate situation. The Ronin had clearly violated the law prohibiting private revenge. They had committed murder. By any strict interpretation of the law, they should be executed as criminals, put to death in a degrading manner that would serve as a warning to others. But the Ronin had also done something that resonated deeply with samurai culture and with the common people of Edo. They had fulfilled an obligation to their lord. They had sacrificed 2 years of their lives, enduring poverty and humiliation, for the sake of honoring his memory. They had demonstrated through their actions what loyalty meant. They had shown that there were values deeper than mere obedience to the shogun's law, values like duty, honor, and loyalty to one's master. Moreover, the assassination had occurred in a way that minimized its broader threat to the shogunate's authority. The Ronin had not attempted a coup. They had not challenged the shogun's power. They had simply executed a man they believed had wronged their lord. In many respects, their actions were a vindication of samurai values, even if those values were technically in conflict with state law. The shogunate's decision was to allow the Ronin to commit seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than to execute them as criminals. This was an enormous concession. It meant that the Ronin would die honorable deaths, that they would be remembered not as criminals but as loyal samurai who had fulfilled their duty to their lord. It meant that their sacrifice would be recognized and honored by society. On the appointed day, all 47 Ronin performed seppuku. They died with the dignity and composure expected of samurai. They died believing that they had honored their lord and that their names would be remembered. And they were correct. Their names have indeed been remembered. The story of the 47 Ronin, or Akoroshi, as they are known in Japanese, became one of the most famous stories in Japanese history, a tale of loyalty, sacrifice, and the tension between individual honor and state authority. But the assassination and its aftermath had profound consequences. that extended far beyond the deaths of these 47 men. First, the event revealed a fundamental tension in Edo society. The conflict between the shogunate's attempt to create a stable, law-based state and the persistent power of samurai culture and values. The Ronin's actions had violated the law, and yet society did not condemn them as criminals. Instead, they were celebrated as heroes. This celebration represented a form of resistance to the shogunate's authority, a suggestion that there were sources of legitimacy and meaning beyond the shogun's edicts. This tension would persist throughout the Edo period and would eventually contribute to the shogunate's downfall in the mid-19th century. As the shogunate's power weakened, samurai would increasingly appeal to values of loyalty and honor to justify their actions against the state. The story of the 47 Ronin would become an inspiration for those who believed that loyalty to one's principles was more important than obedience to the law. Second, the event had a profound impact on Japanese culture and literature. The story of the 47 Ronin was told and retold, adapted for the stage, painted in artistic works, discussed in philosophical circles. It became a foundational narrative of Japanese identity, a story about what it meant to be truly loyal, truly honorable, truly human, in a society that valued duty and obligation above all else. The story of men who sacrificed everything for the sake of loyalty to a dead master resonated deeply. The story also served as a meditation on the nature of justice. Kira had insulted Asano, and Asano had responded with violence, and Asano had been executed. The question the 47 Ronin raised through their own actions was this just? The shogunate's laws said yes, but the samurai code said no, and their willingness to sacrifice their lives to correct this injustice, to restore honor to their lord's memory, suggested that there were forms of justice that transcended the law. Third, the event had practical consequences for the shogunate's ability to maintain order. The decision to allow the Ronin to die honorably, rather than executing them as criminals, was a tacit acknowledgement that the shogunate could not simply override samurai values and expect the samurai class to remain loyal. The compromise preserved the shogunate's authority in the short term, but planted seeds of future conflict. Samurai throughout Japan understood that loyalty to one's lord might supersede obedience to the shogun, and that the shogunate would eventually have to reckon with this. Finally, there is a question that historians have debated for centuries. Did the shogunate's decision to allow the Ronin an honorable death strengthen or weaken samurai loyalty to the state? On one hand, it might have appeared to strengthen it. The shogunate was acknowledging and honoring samurai values. But on another level, it revealed that the shogunate was afraid of samurai culture, that it could not simply impose its will on the samurai class without risking rebellion. This fear would eventually undermine the shogunate's authority. The 47 Ronin were buried near the temple where their lord Asano was buried. Their graves became a shrine, a place where people came to pay respects to men who had demonstrated the ultimate form of loyalty. Over the centuries, their story evolved. It was adapted into plays, into novels, into films. It became the template for how Japanese people understood loyalty and honor. But there is a darker reading of this story that is sometimes overlooked. The 47 Ronin's actions, while celebrated as heroic and loyal, were also deeply destructive. They killed a man outside the legal system. They demonstrated that violence could be justified outside the framework of state authority. They showed that individuals could pursue their own conception of justice, regardless of what the law said. Kira's crime, insulting Asano, was significant. But it was not a crime that deserved death under any reasonable legal standard. Yet the 47 Ronin killed him for it, and society celebrated their deed. What does this say about the nature of justice in their world? What does it say about the kinds of violence that societies are willing to tolerate and even celebrate? These are questions that Japanese thinkers have grappled with for nearly 3 centuries, and they are questions that remain relevant today. The story of the 47 Ronin is not simply a tale of loyalty and honor. It is also a story about the limits of law, the persistence of alternative moral codes, and the possibility that justice and legality are not always the same thing. The Ronin believed that they were serving justice, that they were righting a wrong that the law had failed to address, and in their world with their values they were correct. But that belief, that conviction that one's own sense of justice can override the law, is also dangerous. It is the justification that revolutionaries and terrorists use for their actions. The 47 Ronin story, for all its beauty and nobility, also contains within it a warning about the dangers of placing loyalty and honor above obedience to law and the state. And yet, in the end they are remembered not as cautionary figures but as heroes. Their graves are visited by thousands of people each year who come to pay respects to men who died for loyalty. Their story is told to children as an example of the highest form of human virtue. In Japanese culture, they represent an ideal. The ideal of the person who is willing to sacrifice everything, including life itself, for the sake of duty and honor. Story 3. The Aftermath and the Legacy. How Insult and Honor Transformed Edo Society. Section 1. The Turning Point. When 2 deaths changed everything. You are in Edo in the year 1705, 3 years after the 47 Ronin performed their seppuku on the frozen ground of a Buddhist temple. The city has settled back into its rhythms of commerce and ceremony. But something has fundamentally shifted in the way people understand honor, loyalty, and the nature of power itself. The execution of the Ronin did not end their story, it transformed it. And that transformation would ripple through Japanese society for the next century and a half, gradually reshaping the very foundations of the social order. To understand what happened in Edo after the deaths of the 47 Ronin, you must first understand what had happened 70 years earlier, when the merchant Tanaka was killed by the Ronin over an insult. These 2 events, Tanaka's death in 1635 and the 47 Ronin's revenge in 1702, seem separate when viewed individually. But when you examine them together, you begin to see a pattern emerging, a slow transformation of society that these violent moments both reflected and accelerated. In 1635, when Tanaka was killed, the merchant class had accepted their subordinate position in society as natural and inevitable. The hierarchy was clear: samurai at the top, farmers below them, artisans below that, and merchants at the very bottom. This order was justified by Confucian philosophy, by centuries of tradition, by the apparent stability of the system. A merchant who was killed by a samurai for an insult was simply experiencing the logical consequence of his low status. He had overstepped. He had forgotten his place. His death was unfortunate but comprehensible within the framework of society as it was understood. But by 1702, something had changed. The 47 Ronin's assassination of Kira, and more importantly the shogunate's decision to allow them an honorable death, had created a crisis of meaning in Edo society. If the Ronin were celebrated as heroes, if their loyalty to their dead lord was honored above the law, if they could commit murder and be remembered as noble rather than criminal, then what did the law actually mean? What was the actual basis of the shogunate's authority? The answers to these questions were not provided explicitly. The shogunate did not issue proclamations explaining their reasoning. Instead, the answers emerged gradually, through stories, through artistic representations, through the way that people discussed and debated the meaning of the Ronin's actions. In the years immediately following 1702, the story of the 47 Ronin was adapted for the kabuki stage. Kabuki was the popular theater of Edo, performed in public theaters that were accessible to common people, merchants, artisans, servants. These adaptations were not dry historical recreations. They were emotionally intense dramas that emphasized the loyalty of the Ronin, their suffering, their sacrifice. They presented the Ronin as heroes, as men who had done what was right even though it violated the law. The shogunate, sensing that these plays were becoming politically dangerous, attempted to suppress them. Officials banned performances that too directly recreated the assassination of Kira, or too explicitly criticized the shogunate's authority. But the ban only increased the play's appeal. Audiences came to see the forbidden dramas, understanding them as statements of resistance to official authority. Underground versions circulated. Adaptations were created that changed the names and details to circumvent the censorship but told, essentially, the same story. What was remarkable about this cultural response to the 47 Ronin was that it was not limited to samurai circles. Common people, merchants, artisans, servants were deeply moved by the story. They came to understand it not as a samurai story but as a human story. A story about loyalty, about sacrifice, about standing up for what was right even when the law said otherwise. And this democratization of the Ronin's story had consequences. As more people, particularly merchants and common people, identified with the Ronin struggle, they began to question the assumptions underlying the social hierarchy. If a samurai could violate the law in the name of loyalty and be honored for it, why could a merchant not do the same? If individual morality could supersede state law, then what was the actual basis of the hierarchy that kept merchants subordinate? These were not revolutionary questions in an explicit sense. No one was organizing uprisings or calling for the overthrow of the shogunate. But they were destabilizing questions, questions that undermined the mental framework through which people understood their society. At the same time, something else was happening in Edo's economy. The merchant class, despite their low social status, was accumulating wealth at an extraordinary rate. This was not a conscious revolution. It was simply the result of economic forces. The shogunate's policy of requiring all daimyo to maintain residences in Edo and to travel to the capital regularly had created enormous demand for goods and services. Merchants provided those goods and services and profited enormously. Money flowed to them constantly. By the early 18th century, some merchants were wealthier than many daimyo. They could afford to commission the finest artists, to build beautiful homes, to patronize temples and cultural institutions, but they still could not hold political power. They still could not wear swords. They still had to bow to samurai who were, in economic terms, far poorer than they were. This contradiction between economic power and social status created a psychological tension that was difficult to maintain. How long could society sustain a system in which the officially superior class, samurai, was economically inferior to the officially subordinate class, merchants? How long could people accept laws and hierarchies that seemed increasingly at odds with economic reality? The answer, it turned out, was not very long. But the transformation would take time. It would require more than stories and economic contradictions. It would require specific events that would force the contradictions to become undeniable. One such event occurred in 1709, 7 years after the 47 Ronin's seppuku. In a temple in the provinces, a group of samurai attacked and killed the shogun's representative, a bureaucrat who had been attempting to collect taxes. The samurai involved claimed they were acting in response to perceived disrespect and injustice. But the shogunate's response was swift and brutal. The samurai were hunted down and executed. Their lands were confiscated. Their families were destroyed. But what was remarkable was that there was no mass uprising in their defense, no kabuki plays celebrating their loyalty, no cultural outpouring of sympathy. The difference between this event and the 47 Ronin's assassination was instructive. The Ronin had acted in response to what people understood as a genuine, personal insult to their lord. They had waited 2 years, demonstrating extraordinary restraint and loyalty. They had acted with precision and honor. They had then accepted their punishment without resistance. These samurai, by contrast, had acted impulsively and had attacked a representative of the state itself, not a private individual who had committed a personal transgression. They appeared to many observers as rebels, not as loyal retainers avenging their lord. The distinction was crucial. It suggested that even as the story of the 47 Ronin was transforming how people thought about loyalty and honor, there were still limits to how far that transformation would go. One could honor loyalty to a dead lord, but one could not rebel against the state itself. Yet the line between these two was blurry and everyone understood it. If loyalty to one's lord could justify assassination, could it not eventually justify rebellion against the shogun, if one's lord ordered it? If individual morality could supersede state law in the name of honor, could it not eventually lead to the overthrow of the state? These were the questions that haunted the shogunate's administration in the decades following 1702. They were questions about the stability of the system, about whether the compromise that had allowed the 47 Ronin an honorable death had been wise or foolish. Meanwhile, in the world of commerce and ordinary life, another transformation was occurring. The merchant class, emboldened by their growing wealth and inspired by the story of the 47 Ronin, a story that suggested that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through loyalty and sacrifice, began to develop their own culture, their own aesthetic, their own sense of what was valuable and meaningful. Merchants began to patronize artists and writers. They commissioned paintings and sculptures. They built beautiful homes with gardens and tea houses. They developed their own form of refined culture that rivaled, and in some ways surpassed, the traditional culture of the samurai and the aristocracy. They created a world in which money and taste mattered more than bloodline and warrior training. This merchant culture was not overtly political. Merchants were not calling for revolution or for changes to the political system, but by creating an alternative center of cultural authority, by suggesting that merchants could be cultured and refined and worthy of respect despite their low social status. They were quietly undermining the assumptions on which the hierarchy rested. By the mid-18th century, the situation in Edo had become increasingly paradoxical. Samurai still held political power. They still carried swords. They still occupied the top of the social hierarchy. But merchants were wealthier, more educated, more influential in terms of culture and aesthetics. The hierarchy and reality had diverged significantly. This divergence created a kind of psychological split in Edo society. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The rituals of hierarchy were maintained. Samurai were deferred to. Merchants bowed. Laws were followed. But beneath the surface, the fundamental assumptions that held the system together were coming apart. And it was the story of Tanaka's death in 1635, and the 47 Ronin's revenge in 1702, that had set this process in motion. These two events had raised fundamental questions about insult, honor, loyalty, and the nature of justice that society could not definitively answer within the existing framework. The compromise solutions that the authorities had attempted, executing the Ronin who killed Tanaka with ritual honor, allowing the 47 Ronin to die with honor, had temporarily stabilized the system. But they had also acknowledged that there were values and principles that transcended the law, and once that acknowledgement had been made, it could not be unmade. What would eventually resolve these contradictions was not a gradual evolution, but a sudden rupture. In 1868, over 150 years after the 47 Ronin's revenge, the Tokugawa shogunate would fall. Samurai would lose their power and their status. The merchant class would rise to prominence. Japan would transform into a modern nation-state with a different system of government and different understanding of hierarchy and authority. But the seeds of this transformation had been planted in 1635 when a merchant was killed for an insult. And they had begun to grow in 1702, when 47 masterless warriors sacrificed their lives for loyalty to a dead master. These two events had revealed the contradictions at the heart of Edo society, contradictions that would only be resolved through the total transformation of the system. Story 3. The Aftermath and the Legacy. How Insult and Honor Transformed. Edo Society Section. The Cultural Revolution, when stories became more powerful than laws. decades following 1702, witnessed something unprecedented in Japanese history: the gradual transformation of a society's understanding of itself through storytelling and cultural production. This was not a political revolution in the traditional sense. There were no manifestos, no mass organizations, no explicit calls for change. Instead, what occurred was a slow, almost invisible shift in how people thought about honor, loyalty, and the meaning of their own lives. The catalyst for this transformation was the story of the 47 Ronin. But the story did not remain static. It evolved, adapted, took on new meanings as it was told and retold in different contexts and to different audiences. This evolution reveals something profound about how societies change, not through top-down mandates but through the gradual transformation of meaning and value through culture. In the years immediately after 1702, the most popular version of the 47 Ronin story was the kabuki adaptation. The first kabuki play about the Ronin was performed in 1706, just 4 years after their seppuku. Despite the shogunate's attempts at censorship, this play became enormously popular. It was performed repeatedly, revised, adapted. Multiple versions existed, each emphasizing different aspects of the story. What is crucial to understand is that these kabuki plays were not performed for an elite audience of samurai and aristocrats. They were performed in public theaters accessible to ordinary people. The audiences included merchants, artisans, servants, women, children. These were people who had no direct experience of samurai culture, who had never served a lord, who had never faced the question of loyalty to a master. And yet, through the kabuki plays they came to understand the Ronin's actions as noble, as worthy of respect and remembrance. This was revolutionary in its implications. By making the 47 Ronin story accessible to common people, the kabuki theater was suggesting that ordinary people could understand and appreciate the highest values of samurai culture. It was suggesting that loyalty, sacrifice, and honor were not the exclusive possession of the warrior class but universal human values that anyone could recognize and admire. Moreover, the plays emphasized aspects of the story that resonated with merchant and common experiences. They focused on the Ronin's suffering during their 2 years of waiting, on their poverty, on their humiliation. These were experiences that merchants and common people could understand directly. The plays showed the Ronin as men like themselves, hungry, desperate, struggling, who nonetheless maintained their principles and their loyalty. This identification between the Ronin and the audience created a powerful emotional connection. At the same time, the plays subtly shifted the moral framework through which the story was understood. In the official narrative, the shogunate's narrative, the Ronin's revenge was an act of private vengeance that happened to result in death for all involved. It was presented as a tragedy, a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal honor to override state law. But in the kabuki adaptations, the revenge was presented as a triumph of human values over bureaucratic law. The Ronin were heroes because they had remained true to their principles, not despite the fact that they died as a result. This subtle shift in moral emphasis was politically significant. It was suggesting to audiences that there were circumstances in which breaking the law was justified, in which personal morality could supersede official authority. This message was dangerous to the shogunate, which is why they attempted to suppress the plays. But the suppression only increased their appeal and their reach. Beyond the kabuki stage, the story of the 47 Ronin was also being preserved and transmitted through other cultural forms. Scholars wrote detailed historical accounts. Novelists created elaborate fictional versions that explored the Ronin's internal experiences, their doubts and struggles. Artists created paintings and woodblock prints depicting key moments from the story. Poets wrote verses about the Ronin's loyalty and sacrifice. The story was woven into the cultural fabric of Japan, becoming a reference point for how people thought about loyalty and honor. This cultural saturation had a profound effect on how ordinary people understood their own lives and their own obligations. If the 47 Ronin were celebrated for their loyalty to their lord, did that not suggest that loyalty was the highest value? Did it not suggest that one should be willing to sacrifice everything, wealth, status, life itself, for the sake of loyalty to those one was obligated to serve? For merchants, this message was particularly complex. Merchants were beginning to accumulate wealth and power, but they were still officially subordinate to samurai. Loyalty to whom should they feel? Should they remain subordinate to the samurai class that still held political power? Or could they redirect their loyalty toward their own commercial networks, their own families, their own communities? The story of the 47 Ronin did not provide an explicit answer to these questions. But by elevating loyalty and honor as supreme values, it created a framework in which merchants could begin to reimagine their own role in society. If loyalty was the highest value, then perhaps a merchant who was loyal to his customers, to his employees, to his guild, to his community, was demonstrating the same virtue that the Ronin had demonstrated. Perhaps loyalty did not require subordination to a samurai master. Perhaps it could take other forms. This reframing of loyalty had enormous consequences. It allowed merchants to maintain a sense of honor and dignity, even as they accumulated wealth outside the official power structure. It allowed them to see themselves not as parasites on society, as the old Confucian philosophy suggested, but as worthy members of society who were living according to noble principles. But the transformation went deeper than just the reframing of loyalty. The story of the 47 Ronin also raised fundamental questions about justice and law that Japanese thinkers grappled with for decades. If the Ronin's revenge was celebrated as just even though it violated the law, then what was the relationship between justice and legality? Was the law simply an instrument of state power, or was it meant to reflect some deeper moral order? Buddhist and Confucian philosophers debated these questions intensely. Some argued that the Ronin's actions, while admirable in terms of loyalty, had still violated the proper order and should not be celebrated. Others argued that the Ronin had perceived a higher form of justice, the restoration of honor to their lord's name, that transcended the shogunate's law. Still others attempted to synthesize these positions, suggesting that both loyalty and obedience to the state were important values, and that the tragedy of the Ronin's story lay precisely in the conflict between these values. What, Emerged from these debates was a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between individual virtue and state authority. It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the simplistic hierarchy in which samurai authority was simply accepted as legitimate. Instead, philosophers began to ask, on what basis is authority legitimate? What obligations do individuals have to obey unjust laws? When, if ever, is it right to violate the law in the name of a higher principle? These were not new questions in the history of philosophy, but they were new to Edo Japan. By raising them, the story of the 47 Ronin was transforming how educated people thought about politics and morality. Meanwhile, in the world of merchant culture, a parallel transformation was occurring. Merchants, inspired by the story of the Ronin and emboldened by their growing wealth, began to develop increasingly sophisticated critiques of the samurai-dominated system. These critiques were not expressed openly. That would have been dangerous, but rather were embedded in merchant literature, in the theater and poetry that merchants sponsored, in the aesthetic values that merchant culture promoted. One particularly important cultural development was the rise of a merchant-sponsored aesthetic known as iki, term roughly translatable as refined simplicity or elegant restraint. Iki was an aesthetic that valued subtlety, understatement, and the appreciation of refined beauty in ordinary things. It was in many ways opposed to the more ostentatious displays of samurai culture, which emphasized status symbols and wealth. By promoting iki as an aesthetic ideal, merchants were making a cultural statement. They were suggesting that true refinement did not require power or status or the display of wealth. It could be found in the simplest tea house, in the most humble garden, in the most ordinary moment. This was a direct challenge to the samurai claim that refinement was an exclusive property of the warrior class. What is striking about this cultural transformation is that it occurred almost entirely outside the official political system. There were no new laws, no changes to the official hierarchy, no open challenges to samurai authority. And yet through stories, through aesthetic values, through the gradual redefining of what was considered noble and worthy of respect, the entire psychological and cultural foundation of the hierarchy was being slowly dismantled. By the mid-18th century, a visitor to Edo would have observed a society that appeared, on the surface, to be functioning exactly as it always had. Samurai still held official power. The hierarchy was still formally acknowledged. The laws were still enforced. But beneath the surface, the meaning of these forms had fundamentally shifted. Samurai power, once understood as naturally superior and legitimate, was increasingly seen as merely one form of power among several. Merchant wealth and cultural sophistication were increasingly recognized as sources of prestige and influence that could rival, and in some cases exceed, samurai status. This cultural revolution, this transformation of society through the changing of meaning and value, was the most direct consequence of the deaths of Tanaka in 1635 and the 47 Ronin in 1702. These two events, separated by 67 years, had raised questions that society could not definitively answer. In attempting to address these questions, society had gradually transformed itself. The story of the 47 Ronin became, in effect, a mirror in which Japanese society saw itself and its contradictions. Each generation, each social group, saw something different in the story. Different meanings, different lessons, different implications. And in the act of interpreting and reinterpreting the story, society was continuously reshaping its understanding of itself. By the late 18th century, a new way of thinking about Japan had emerged. The old certainties about hierarchy and order were still present, but they were now contested and questioned. Samurai still ruled, but their right to rule was no longer simply assumed. Merchants were still officially subordinate, but their actual influence and respect were growing steadily. The system was becoming unstable, not because anyone was actively trying to overthrow it, but because the cultural meaning that had held it together was eroding away. This erosion would accelerate in the 19th century as Japan encountered Western powers and began to modernize. The samurai class would eventually be abolished, not through a violent revolution but through a series of deliberate policy choices. Merchants would rise to prominence as Japan industrialized. The hierarchy that had seemed so eternal, so natural, so inevitable would dissolve within a single generation. But the process that made this transformation possible had begun decades earlier, in the stories told in kabuki theaters, in the cultural productions of merchants, in the philosophical debates that followed the deaths of Tanaka and the 47 Ronin. Section 3. The End of Hierarchy. When insult lost its power to kill you are in Japan in the year 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate has just collapsed. The Meiji Restoration has begun. Japan is transforming itself at breathtaking speed, abandoning centuries of feudal tradition and attempting to become a modern nation-state capable of competing with Western powers. In this moment of radical transformation, something remarkable occurred. The samurai class, which had dominated Japanese society for nearly 7 centuries, was systematically dismantled by government decree. The samurai were not overthrown through violence or revolution. Instead, they were abolished through law. The government issued edicts prohibiting the wearing of swords, abolishing the samurai's exclusive right to bear arms, dissolving the feudal domains and replacing them with modern prefectures. Samurai who had once been the supreme warriors of society were suddenly ordinary citizens. Their status was stripped away through legislation. Their power disappeared not through defeat in battle, but through the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen. What is remarkable about this transformation is that it was possible. A society that had organized itself around samurai power and samurai values for centuries suddenly and completely abandoned that organization. How was this possible? How could a hierarchy that had seemed so natural, so eternal, so justified by centuries of tradition, simply collapse? The answer lies in the cultural and philosophical transformation that had begun with Tanaka's death in 1635 and accelerated with the 47 Ronin's revenge in 1702. By the time the Meiji Restoration occurred in 1868, the cultural meaning of the samurai hierarchy had eroded so completely that it was possible to dismantle it without massive resistance or violent civil war. But this erosion of meaning had not occurred accidentally. It had been a gradual process. facilitated by stories, by cultural production, by the slow transformation of how people thought about honor and loyalty and the basis of social order. The key to understanding this transformation is to recognize what had happened to the concept of insult. By the late 19th century, in 1635, when Tanaka was killed by a Ronin for an insult was understood as a grave threat to the social order. It was something that could justify violence, that could warrant death. An insult challenged a person's place in the hierarchy, and in a society organized around hierarchy, such a challenge was deeply threatening. But by 1868, insult had lost much of this power. Certainly people could still be offended. Certainly conflicts could still arise from perceived disrespect, but insult could no longer routinely justify killing. The law no longer recognized insult as a justification for violence in the way that it once had. More importantly, society no longer believed that insult was a grave enough offense to warrant death. This change in how insult was understood was not the result of any explicit legal reform. Rather, it was the result of a gradual shift in values that had occurred through cultural and philosophical discourse. As the story of the 47 Ronin was told and retold, as merchants accumulated wealth and respect despite their low official status, as new philosophical ideas entered Japan from the West, the belief that honor was so fragile that it required constant violent defense began to fade. What accelerated this shift dramatically was Japan's encounter with Western powers in the mid-19th century. When Japanese officials encountered Western nations, they found societies organized on completely different principles. Western governments did not seem to place the same emphasis on personal honor and hierarchical deference. Western merchants and commoners seemed to possess agency and respect, despite having no samurai status. Western nations had powerful militaries and advanced technology without organizing themselves around a warrior elite dedicated to a feudal lord. This encounter with an alternative way of organizing society profoundly shook Japanese confidence in their existing system. If the samurai hierarchy was natural and inevitable, how could alternative systems exist? If honor and loyalty were the supreme values, why did Western societies, which seemed not to organize themselves around these values, appear so powerful? These questions led some Japanese thinkers to begin reconceptualizing what honor actually meant. Perhaps honor was not about individual status in a rigid hierarchy. Perhaps it was about loyalty to a nation, rather than to a feudal lord. Perhaps the samurai values of courage and loyalty could be preserved and redirected toward building a modern nation-state rather than toward maintaining a feudal hierarchy. This reconceptualization of honor and loyalty was crucial. It allowed the architects of the Meiji Restoration to present the abolition of the samurai class, not as a betrayal of samurai values, but as their fulfillment in a new form. They argued that true loyalty meant loyalty to Japan as a nation, not loyalty to individual feudal lords. They argued that true courage meant the courage to abandon outdated traditions in order to build a stronger nation. They argued that the samurai could serve modern Japan better as educated modern citizens than as warriors bound to a feudal code. Some samurai accepted this argument, They took government positions, became officials, educators, military officers in the new modern army. They transformed their loyalty and their skills into service to the nation-state, rather than to feudal lords. In this way, samurai values were not destroyed but rather were redirected and reformulated for a new context. But some samurai did not accept this transformation. They viewed the abolition of the samurai class as a betrayal of everything their ancestors had stood for. They saw the new government as illegitimate, as having abandoned the true sources of authority and honor. These samurai attempted to resist the transformation, and in doing so they raised one final time the fundamental questions about honor and insult that had haunted Japanese society for nearly 2.5 centuries. The most famous of these resistances was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. A group of samurai led by Saigo Takamori, a respected military officer who had originally supported the Meiji Restoration but had become disenchanted with its direction, organized an armed rebellion. They believed that the new government had betrayed samurai principles, and that they had an obligation to resist, even if resistance meant death. The rebellion was crushed relatively quickly by the modern Japanese military, an army that had been trained in Western military tactics and armed with modern weapons. The samurai rebels fighting with traditional weapons and traditional tactics were no match for the modernized military. Saigo Takamori, facing defeat, committed suicide in the traditional samurai manner. But what is remarkable about the Satsuma Rebellion is not that it failed. Many rebellions fail. What is remarkable is how little sympathy it generated among the Japanese people. In an earlier era, a samurai rebellion against what was perceived as unjust authority might have sparked mass uprisings, might have been celebrated as an act of noble resistance. But by 1877, most Japanese people did not view the rebellion in this way. They viewed it as an act of resistance to progress, as samurai clinging to outdated ways, as an impediment to Japan's modernization. The Satsuma Rebellion marks the symbolic end of the samurai era. After this rebellion was crushed, there was no serious attempt by samurai to resist the new order. The samurai class, which had seemed so powerful, so eternal, so essential to society, simply dissolved. Within a generation, the samurai were primarily a historical memory rather than a living social force. What made this transformation possible was the erosion of the cultural meaning of the samurai hierarchy that had occurred over the previous 2.5 centuries. By 1868, the belief that samurai were naturally superior, that hierarchy was eternal and justified, that honor required constant violent defense. All of these beliefs had been undermined by stories, by cultural production, by philosophical debate, by the demonstrated success of alternative ways of organizing society. Tanaka's death in 1635 had raised the question, what gives someone the right to kill another person? The Ronin's answer had been an insult to one's honor, but that answer had gradually been questioned and challenged. By the time of the Meiji Restoration, a different answer had emerged. No one has the right to kill another person based on an insult. Other ways of addressing insult exist. legal redress, social sanctions, the restoration of honor through other means. This change in how insult was understood and how it should be addressed was not a small matter. It was fundamental to the transformation of society. As long as insult could justify violence, the samurai's monopoly on violence could be justified. But once insult could no longer justify violence, once society accepted that there were better ways to address insult than through killing, then the samurai's exclusive right to carry weapons and use violence became harder to justify. The 47 Ronin's revenge in 1702 had raised another crucial question. When is violence justified? The answer the Ronin had provided was, when one's lord has been wronged and the law has failed to provide justice. But by the late 19th century, this answer was increasingly seen as problematic. If everyone was permitted to decide when the law was unjust and to take action based on that determination, society would descend into chaos. The rule of law required that individuals submit themselves to legal processes, even when those processes seemed unjust. This shift toward belief in the rule of law and away from personal vengeance was accelerated by Japan's encounter with Western legal systems. Western nations had developed sophisticated legal systems that claimed to provide impartial justice. These systems were not perfect, far from it, but they did offer an alternative to the samurai system of personal honor and private revenge. As educated Japanese people became aware of these alternative systems, they began to question whether samurai justice was actually superior, or whether it was simply a way of perpetuating power for those at the top of the hierarchy. By the early 20th century, the entire framework through which insult had been understood in samurai society had been dismantled. Insult was no longer understood as a threat to social order that required violent response. Insult was understood as a personal offense that could be addressed through social pressure, through the legal system, through the court of public opinion. A person's honor was no longer seen as so fragile that it required constant defense through the threat of violence. Instead, honor was understood as something that could be maintained through living a virtuous life, through contributing to society, through being respected by one's peers. This transformation in how insult and honor were understood was not unique to Japan. Similar transformations occurred throughout the world, as societies modernized and shifted from feudal or hierarchical systems to modern nation-states based on law and rational administration. But what is remarkable about the Japanese case is how completely and rapidly the transformation occurred, and how much it owed to cultural and philosophical processes that had begun centuries earlier. The story of Tanaka's death in 1635 and the 47 Ronin's revenge in 1702 were not the direct causes of this transformation, but they were crucial moments in which the contradictions of the samurai system became visible. They were moments in which fundamental questions about honor, loyalty, justice, and the basis of social order were raised. And in the centuries that followed, as these questions were debated and discussed and explored through stories and philosophy and cultural production, Japanese society was gradually transformed. By the time the Meiji Restoration occurred, the cultural ground had already shifted sufficiently that the rapid dismantling of the samurai class became possible. The beliefs that had sustained that class for centuries had been eroded away. The alternative, a modern nation-state based on law and rational administration rather than on feudal hierarchy, seemed not just possible but inevitable and desirable. What remains most striking about this long historical process is how much it was driven by meaning and culture rather than by material forces alone. The samurai class did not lose its power primarily because merchants became wealthier, though that certainly happened. The samurai class lost its power because the cultural meaning of samurai status was transformed, because stories like the 47 Ronins raised uncomfortable questions that society could not answer within the existing framework. Because philosophers and writers and artists gradually developed alternative ways of understanding honor, loyalty, and the basis of social order. The two deaths that frame this narrative, Tanaka's in 1635 and the 47 Ronins in 1702, were violent events that occurred at specific moments in time. But their consequences unfolded over centuries, through stories and debates and cultural transformations that few people at the time would have recognized as revolutionary. This is how societies actually change, not through dramatic revolutions alone, but through the slow erosion of meaning, through the transformation of how people understand their world, through stories that raise questions that existing systems cannot adequately answer. And what began with a merchant's insult to a Ronin and a Ronin's fatal response ultimately transformed the entire basis on which Japanese society was organized. An insult, a seemingly trivial act of disrespect, set in motion a chain of events that would reshape a civilization. In our own time, when we face social transformations and wonder how change actually occurs, when we ask whether individuals can affect history, when we question whether culture matters or whether only material forces drive change, we might look back to the story of Tanaka and the 47 Ronin and find some answers. We might recognize that insult and honor, though they seem personal and individual, are actually windows into the deepest structures of society. We might understand that a single moment of violence can echo through centuries, raising questions that society must eventually answer. And we might appreciate that the stories we tell about past events are not mere entertainment or nostalgia but are the primary means through which societies understand themselves and gradually transform their understanding of what is possible and what is right. The question with which we began, what happened when you insulted a samurai, leads us ultimately to a much larger question. How do societies change? And the answer that emerges from the history of Tanaka, the 47 Ronin, and the transformation of Edo Japan is both humbling and inspiring. Societies change through the accumulation of small shifts in meaning, through stories that raise questions, through the slow erosion of beliefs that once seemed eternal and inevitable. The power to transform society may lie not primarily with those who hold military force or political power, but with those who shape how society understands itself, the storytellers, the philosophers, the artists, the ordinary people who decide which stories to tell and what meanings to draw from them.